Welcome back. You're watching Cheche with today's guests, Kenya's ambassador to the WTO, Ambassador Dr. Stephen Ndungu Karau, and the Managing Director for the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development, Deborah Voorhees. We're unpacking the WTO Ministerial Conference and what it means for Kenya and other African countries. And before the break, we got into some of the sticking points. One of the other sticking points, I believe, is, and you touched on it briefly, Ambassador, the classification of countries when they graduate from one level to the other. And we saw China and India feature during the climate change talks, you know, being asked to pay a bit more for their emissions. But it's featuring here in the trade talks because they're classified what? As developing countries. And the feeling is that they should be graduating. Tell us more about that.
Well, China is an enormous country, and it's an enormous country that has experienced the most amazing levels of growth over the recent times. However, it's an enormous country, it's a very populous country, so while it possesses great resources and has made the most amazing strides in terms of industrialization, production and trade, it still does not have an equivalent per capita income to the US or even Singapore or even Malaysia. It has an enormous poor population. It has its own challenges in terms of addressing inequalities within itself. And therefore, it has to do many different things. So we see China has to show solidarity with and work with the other developing countries. It understands it's part of that team. And I think China actually plays an important role, and I'm sure the ambassador would agree with me, in helping and being collaborative with the other developing countries at the WTO. But we understand China is also a large and powerful country. So for African countries, we've seen our trade grow with China as a continent. Oh, I think it has doubled, more than doubled over the last 10 years. So we have to understand what that means, and we have to understand and be strategic about where this relationship with China can and should go. China for sure has a strategy for trading with Africa, but what is our strategy for trading with China into the future? China is a fast-growing economy, so it has...
Deborah, you're also being diplomatic.
No, I'm getting somewhere.
Yes, okay.
I'm getting somewhere. Where I'm getting is China's fast-growing economy means a growing consumer base. Is there a way that we as Africans can get into this? Right now, what does China buy from Africa? Largely commodities. Well, where can this go? That is an economy that is going to be demanding more sophisticated manufacturing products and services, more and more and more. It's a huge market, I believe, for Africa going forward, and we should be strategic about how we can exploit that.
I think we must agree here, as the good diplomats you are, we understand.
They're both based in Geneva.
Yes, but but the fact is, Deborah and Ambassador Karau, is that China actually is not actually a developing country. When you say that,
China and India.
When you say that here in Africa, it's an abuse to us, because China, this aspect of a country being declared developed, and then the backstops with it to declare that actually we are developed. What if I do that for the next 100 years? I'll remain a developing country for 100 years and have to decide by the end of the day.
And taking advantage of the concessions that
when India is summoning presidents of the world, India can summon, we saw heads of state from Africa in India, even donning Indian dressings being addressed by the Prime Minister. We have seen again China calling together all African countries. The other day they did it, South Africa. And that is a developing country. Actually, China is competing with the US. China competing with the Western powers. Then we are here telling the world, and for that matter, a world that is depending actually even virtually on China, that China is a developing country.
But do you want China to go away? Do you think we do not and cannot benefit from trade with China? Let's get real. It's an opportunity for us as well.
But who's asking China to go away?
I'm not saying, I'm just saying, do you want China to go away, or do you want to work collaboratively with China, who does share some understanding of our situation, who is interested in this continent, who is investing in this continent?
So the point you're making is that it benefits us, for China and India, to be classified as developing countries.
I think it allows us to be in a team with them, and it enhances our ability to develop common
I think maybe to chip in, we said earlier, each country will always advance its agenda and its own interests. And China and India are our very good friends. By that I mean good friends of Kenya, good friends of Africa. Most of the African countries would not have been to this meeting, the least developed countries, were it not for the support of China. You also saw them have the China Roundtable on Monday, which again brought in the African LDCs to try and uplift them and bring them to the world stage. So they are taking their own responsibility. But having said that, classification of countries and the way countries classify themselves is the hot potato within WTO, in the sense that you self-graduate. You actually, as a country, decide it's now in my interest to be classified as developed. It's not any other country to do it for you. It's not any other organization to do it for you, so we cannot force them. Deborah has just touched on the large populations that we have. If you go to some of these countries, you'll actually see the poverty yourself. You don't have to be told that this is a poor homestead, this is a poor family. But having said that, China is the second largest economy. People will get surprised that it's still classified as a developing country. But as I said, they will always advance their interests the best way they know how to. We understand, because all countries are developing. They will not stop developing when they are called developed countries. So, but I think classification needs to be done. Okay, so let's move on.
Our time is running out. There's this issue about trade, and we spoke about it briefly during the break. But for the benefit of our listeners, how, within the context of the WTO, can we boost intra-African trade? Because at the moment, it's quite low. And so we're looking, you know, for most African countries, the volume of trade with the West is much higher than the volume of trade with neighboring countries.
Yes, I think that's a very fundamental issue. Africa needs to trade with itself better. If you, for example, look at something very simple. If I'm a businessman and I want to travel within Africa and say I want to visit, say, 28 African countries.
You need 28 visas.
Other than within East Africa, where I will not need a visa, for the rest of the 25, I'll need a visa. If I'm going to trade within the EU, the 28 countries, I only need one visa. That is something that Africa doesn't need the West to come and help us do. It's something we can sort ourselves. But having said that, Africa is just coming up. We are getting into the highly tumultuous area of insecurity and so on. So hopefully, development doesn't come easy. Eventually, we'll get there. Everyone in due course will see the need to open up and to have these visas. We need to develop the infrastructure as well. That is a big challenge within Africa, and Africa is already doing it, but we need to do more and more.
Without much interruption, Ambassador, because you have raised a very important issue. May I ask, because you have been there, international stage and national, what is this that is stopping Africa to have one visa, for example?
As I just touched on it, development has been coming and coming slowly. We have been developing from the era of, there's nothing to hide, the eras of coups, the eras of insecurity. So countries need to also develop confidence with each other. And as development comes, you'll also see some of these things coming up gradually. Now, the EU has also not come easy. It's been developing since the Second World War. In fact, in some arenas, some of the biggest achievement the world has done since the end of the Second World War is creating the WTO today, and having the WTO, trade and having organized trade stops wars. I don't know whether you know it, but the Second World War had a lot to do with trade. First World War, the same. Without going into that debate, the other biggest creation since the Second World War again, is the EU. It has taken a lot of debates, a lot of agony, a lot of sacrifice. It is there. So Africa needs to get there. We need to get together, make Africa look like one, and that would be my dream. We need to get there. The 54 African countries crisscrossing each other, no visas. That is the future. I look to the day that we can have the Afro, just like the Euro.
So we're on the road, Ambassador. We've made tremendous strides in Africa, in Southern Africa and in East Africa, with the tripartite signed last year that brings together, it connects all the countries from Cairo to Cape Town, with the possibility for a much freer trade, which will mean lower costs. It will mean greater intra-African trade. And we know when Africa trades with itself, it's with greater diversity of goods and services, it's with a greater level of sustainability into the economy, and now we've seen the launch of the Continental Free Trade Agreement talks. The prospects, I think, are good. There will be a lot of hard work, but I think your dream could still come true in our lifetime, Ambassador.
Yes, and we are also asking African countries to endorse the TFA, the Trade Facilitation Agreement. It's good for us. Some countries are still very skeptical. They think it's a tool of the West.
Yeah, in what way
it's good. For example, see the magic that it has done for East Africa. We used to have customs systems that were very restrictive. It used to take up to a month to get goods moving from Mombasa to Rwanda, Kigali. Now it's taking a matter of days. I think that's one of the biggest achievement that that has happened. It didn't happen by accident. We have had a program, again assisted by the developed country, the TIMIA program, which has been trying to do just that. Trade facilitation in reality, in
What
real
about
terms.
the rules of origin? Where does that come in? Because I think within the Kenyan context, it's been about sugar.
Yes.
And the fact that sugar is repackaged, it comes from Uganda, it comes from Brazil. What are we doing about that? Is that already addressed?
Not quite. In fact, it's one of the issues that is being addressed in this meeting. The rules of origin, particularly with the commodities that say through industries. If you import materials to probably produce a bicycle, for example, when is it your product? When you have imported the various parts and then just put them together and then you send it to country X, is it really your product? So those rules are being refined, and in fact one of the committees in this particular meeting, led by Jamaica, is just looking into that particular issue. So we hope we'll have an outcome in it, among others.
Now, coming to your role as a host ambassador, Kenya, I'm sure you remember, led the walkout about 15 years ago in Mexico. Do you think that Kenya, people like yourself, Ambassador Amina Mohammed, are under undue pressure to have a successful outcome, whatever that may be, at this WTO Ministerial Conference, given the walkout, led by former Trade Minister Mukisa Kitui, but also because Kenya is the African country that's hosting the first WTO Ministerial Conference?
I assure you, we are not under pressure from any quarters. We have had a lot of goodwill. There's a lot of goodwill for this meeting. Almost universally, what I hear from all the 162 members of WTO, they would want a successful ministerial in Nairobi.
And so what would success look like?
Success would be arriving, WTO works by consensus. Producing an agreement at the end of this meeting, a ministerial declaration. You can have a ministerial declaration, you can also have a ministerial statement. So we are looking for a ministerial declaration that is consensually agreed on by all the members. All the members are happy with the product that we produced and are ready to sign into that consensual agreement. So we are hopeful of that, and members do that when they see the agreement has a benefit for them here and there, such that at the end of the day, collectively, all the members are happy.
What's the difference between a declaration and a statement?
A declaration is more powerful, is a more powerful instrument. It kind of sets the agenda for the next 2 years in a more emphatic way. because the ministers have declared this is what you should go and do. They have told you in a formal way this is what you should do. A statement is when there is no maybe consensus, and the chairman of the meeting just gives a statement to say the meeting has come to an end and blah blah blah. So we are hoping that we'll get a ministerial declaration which will help to move Kenya forward, it will help to move Africa forward, and it will also help to move the world forward. We need to look at the globe. It's getting smaller and smaller, by the way, as collectively belonging to us. Okay. So we also want to move the world ahead, the multilateral trading system.
Right. Deborah, what do you make of talk that the WTO is obsolete, and if we can't do away with it, as you were telling us about, these agreements that are taking place outside of the WTO, that we should at least change the way the negotiations are conducted?
No, I don't think the WTO is obsolete at all. I emphatically believe, as I stated earlier, it is the one place where all countries can get together. And it's the only equitable place where everybody can have an equal voice. So I think it's very important for that reason. I think it's very important also because it maintains the system. As Ambassador Corral said, it provides a dispute resolution mechanism that everybody can be part of. And we need to be part. The poorest can only advance if they are part of a game on equal footing with everybody else. However nominal that sounds, you have to make it real. And thirdly, the WTO does good things in terms of its aid for trade program and so on. My key point is that the WTO isn't all that Africa can rely upon. It must rely upon its regional integration process as well. It must rely upon itself, country by country as well, to look at its regulatory environment, to understand what it can do.
But there calls for reform at the UN. We're supposed to have an equal voice there, but it doesn't quite work in that way. And this is where the WTO finds itself. So why should it be exempt for calls for updating?
Maybe just to chip in, the area that is facing a big challenge within WTO is the negotiating function. As I said earlier, you can look at WTO being a government or a parliament for the country, also is both a legislature as well as judiciary. One of the functions is to set rules. Those come through negotiations. And that's the one that is facing a big challenge because it's taking too long. Why is it taking too long? Because all countries have equal powers. As much as the US can stop something being passed, a country like Fiji, Seychelles, will do the same. We have all equal powers. Then you come to the dispute settlement issue, which is the judiciary type, a very, very useful function of the US. Countries take each other to that court and they get their dispute settled. We just had one sorted out in the last 2 weeks between Mexico and the US. So we have to also realize there are those other functions of the WTO.
Okay, Deborah, you were talking about aid for trade and that it should be expanded. To what extent? What do you mean?
Well, I think the Aid for Trade function, the Aid for Trade program of the WTO has made a significant difference. And as the ambassador referred, and I think David did as well, about the pledging conference we saw earlier this week, where a huge amount of money, 90 billion or something, was pledged again to the Enhanced Integrated Framework. I do think, though, it's up to us, it's up to the individual countries in Africa and other developing countries to use that aid wisely, to use it to empower and build our productive capacity across all sectors, to use it to strengthen our institutions. I was amazed at hearing some of the, in a digital economy discussion, some of the applications of digital economy in Africa to strengthen government, on revenue collection, on identification, on e-visas. These are the kinds of things, if we use that aid for trade wisely, we will empower ourselves to trade more. And that's where Africa needs to go.
How do you deal with the individual governments? At what level? So that you can help them to understand, probably give them advice, or even to follow up on what Ambassador has said. Like for the next 2 years, what are these governments doing? Because you may agree, but at home, it is not working. We have seen it in the AU, where actually if you look at what the AU Secretariat is doing, is great. But at the level of government,
implementation is a problem.
This is, the challenge to Africa, I think. It's about individuals, and this is where, if I may plug my own institution, we believe in multi-stakeholder engagement. You cannot leave it to governments alone. Every citizen needs to have a voice. Every citizen needs to think and engage. And whether they are academics in your country or whether they are civil society organizations, trade policy now is a multi-stakeholder process. So we should be contributing to the voice of our governments in these and other venues.
Okay, so we are out of time. As we wind up, I'll come to the panel now because we've attempted to demystify the WTO and its agenda, well, the agenda for, Africa. Ambassador here, the host ambassador, is hoping for a successful outcome, a ministerial declaration. If that doesn't happen, right, if the talks end in disarray, do you think then that the WTO will have become obsolete and we should be talking about some sort of successor organization because the world has changed? Well, we'll start with you.
Not at all. I think I agree.
You're with Deborah?
Yes, that WTO is doing a good job. When you fail once, woodwork does not mean you have failed forever. As Ambassador has put it, the EU, it took years to form the EU, and even they're still working to make it succeed. That does not mean that we say that it has failed or it cannot work. I also do support the work they're trying to do to make sure that there is fair trade among countries of the world. That is good attempt, yeah, and we should support it to the end. But as Deborah has put it, and our own ambassador, although Ambassador Karau, we love you, I know your ability. But when you are playing at the international level, we ask ourselves, how can you help us at the local level, at the national level? All the same, I think whether they agree or they don't agree, it is not a failure. It's not a failure. It is the attempt, the spirit to keep on moving that should drive us.
He's heartened by that. David, what do you think?
I'm an optimist also. I think we
started with a hostile panel, and they've been convinced by our guests.
We must keep pushing, but I'm awake to the fact that WTO is obviously going to be. I think we are trying to extract too much from these discussions as LDCs, and my view is that some of those expectations could be really high. Given that countries have the domestic issues, which is why they are rigid on ceding ground. I think that there are other platforms which developing countries like ours ought to exploit. There are conventions which had the capacity of our countries to engage properly. And I want to say about the aid for trade thing, that we need to spend a little more to develop our technical capacities to produce goods which can access the international market, rather than what we are doing and then we go out there complaining about a level playing ground. There are, for example, opportunities which Africa and developing countries can exploit. For example, take the example of relief food. Wherever there are crises around the world, whether it's Baghdad, whether it is now in Syria and all these places, why is it that the United States has the exclusive right, for example, to supply relief food through World Food Program or whatever other projects? Russia, for example, providing transportation in such crisis. Why are we not leveraging to get those opportunities to offload also our products? I suspect it's because our products are not certified to be supplied.
Or you don't have enough quantity.
Under the standards that are required. And earlier this year we had this engagement with the EU about entry of our goods there, and taking preferences. I don't know how those ones sit with the WTO. But I think the bottom line for me is that we need to up our game so that we can compete. Our products can actually access the market by right, not by privilege.
Okay. Deborah, final thoughts?
That's a great statement, and I really echo what David said. Yeah. We as Africans need to improve our productive capacity. We need to use the WTO, we need to use aid for trade, we need to use our regional integration processes, and we just need to get out there and trade more.
Okay, Ambassador?
Thank you very much. As I said, the biggest challenge for the WTO is the negotiating function, and I believe in due course we'll find a solution and a balance to it so that negotiations don't take too long. I've just said the dispute settlement function of the WTO is there and is there to stay. So WTO has taken time to build. It's not going anywhere, but the negotiating function may be looked at, may be refined and made better. We also need to do a little bit more for ourselves. We need to industrialize, and policies are being put in place within the WTO, special and differential provisions, to make sure that countries get support towards this end. At the end of the day, trade is competition. We have to brace ourselves and get there and compete properly. We'll be supported by our good friends, as I have said, but we must also help ourselves.
Okay.
Thank you.
Our time is up. And today's guests were Kenya's ambassador to the United Nations, the WTO, and other international organizations, Ambassador Dr. Stephen Ndung'u-Karau. We also had the managing director of the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development, Deborah Voorhees. Our thanks for your time. Our thanks also to our panelists, Waweru Mburu and David Makali. This was the final Cheche of the year 2015, and so we thank you for watching and engaging with us here. From myself, Uraka Mimo, and the entire team, we wish you a happy holiday season, and we'll see you next year.
Merry Christmas.